in order to learn about Jesus, we have to read and study the Bible. But for so many people, that's difficult because they don't have the time. They work a full-time job and then they have to come home and take their kids to soccer and then get them ready for bed. And there's just not a lot of time to sit and listen to an hour-long Bible study lesson. So we wanted to start a series for those of you that sounds a lot like your life. Today we're going to start Luke, and we're going to do it in 10 to 15 minute lessons. And I'm hoping that this will help you continue to grow in your faith, even in small little bite-sized pieces. Join us today. All right, good morning. Welcome to our brand new series in Luke. We are going to do this Luke series like we're doing our Acts series. We called our Acts series Acts in 10-ish, which just means I can't really do a 10-minute lesson. That's kind of hard for me, so we had to add the ish on the end of that. So usually they're between 10 to 15 minutes. And we want to do that with Luke. And the reason why we're calling it bite-sized Luke, and the reason why is because there's so many people who don't have an hour to sit and listen to a long 1-hour Bible study. But hopefully, if we can give you little bite-sized portions of a book of the Bible like Luke, I'm hoping that will help you. You could maybe listen to it as a podcast in the morning on your way to work, or if you have 10 minutes at lunch, or whatever that looks like. Because we know this, that as a Christian, we want God to change us on the inside so that we can impact those around us with the good news of Jesus. And we know that the Word of God, the Bible, and the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit living in us, that's what changes our life. So that's why we decided to do this short 10 to 15 minute segments in the Gospel of Luke. So today, let's start with an introduction to Luke, and the backdrop for this series, as you can see behind me, is the beautiful old city of Jerusalem. That picture was taken on the Mount of Olives, so you can kind of see what it looks like over there. But this is all the land where Jesus walked, the land where Jesus taught, where he died on a cross and rose from the dead. And so we wanted to make that as our background for this particular series. Now, let's start with an introduction to Luke. Luke is one of 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there was 4 different men that wrote 4 different of the Gospels. And they wrote to different audiences, which is kind of amazing that they did that to help lots of different people that were raised differently. So for Matthew, his audience was the Jewish people. He was Jewish, so he was writing with them in mind. And so if you notice in Matthew, there's lots of Old Testament scriptures that he quotes because he wants people to see, the Jewish people to see that Jesus is the one who fulfilled all of these scriptures, these prophecies in the Old Testament. So that's why Matthew quotes a lot of Old Testament verses. Mark, on the other hand, for his gospel, he wrote to the Romans. They were a more fast-paced group of people. Mark didn't go into a lot of detail. It's just a quick, here's the story, and then he moves on to the next one. So this is kind of the way Mark wrote. John, he wrote to everyone, okay? By the time he wrote the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke had their Gospels out into the churches and they'd been distributed all over. So John went a different direction, and he wanted to write to people everywhere, not just, specific people groups. And then we have Luke. Luke, this amazing gospel that we're going to study. This was written by Luke for Gentiles, not Jews, because, the Gentiles didn't understand all the Jews and what they did. And so he wrote this book for non-Jewish people like you or me if you're not a Jew. It reminded me, and I was thankful of this, when we went to Israel the very first time we ever went there. I was shocked. We're standing like at the Wailing Wall, and there's all of these Jewish men with weird hats and weird hair things on there, and they're rocking back and forth, and with all this just stuff on, and I was just like, what is that? Okay, because I'm not Jewish. It made no sense to me. And so Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke for people like you and I that don't really understand all the Jewish traditions. So Matthew and John, okay, two of the four, they were actually disciples of Jesus. So they were there. They were eyewitnesses to him. They saw Jesus rise from the dead. They saw Jesus crucified on a cross. They saw him heal people and raise dead people. Like, they were eyewitnesses to what happened. But for Mark, there really was no record that Mark ever knew Jesus. He spent a lot of time with Peter, so when he wrote the Gospel of Mark, most of everything he got was from Peter. But Mark hung out a lot with the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, so we see Mark more in the book of Acts, which leaves us with Luke. And it's kind of fascinating because there's no record that Jesus and Luke even knew each other or that they ever even met. Luke ends up to be a traveling companion with the Apostle Paul. We know Luke was a physician, and so we don't know when he became a Christian. Like, was it after Jesus rose from the dead, or like there's no record of that at all. So what we do know is that Luke is the largest of all the gospel as far as verses are concerned. There's 1,151 verses in Luke. Luke is all about the birth, the life of Jesus, his crucifixion, his resurrection. And then Luke goes on to write a sequel known as Acts. So we're also doing an Acts series and this series. And Acts is really about how the early church started and what happened after Jesus ascended into heaven. So between the two, Luke and Acts, this is a large portion of the New Testament. And what we see about Luke, the author of Luke, was that he was an incredibly faithful friend to Paul. Paul went through a lot of really difficult circumstances that we see in Acts. He's beaten, he's shipwrecked, he's thrown into prison, all of these things. And Paul did these because he loved Jesus and he wanted to get the good news of him out into the world. But what we see is that Luke hung in there with Paul until the very end. 2 Timothy was the last letter that Paul wrote before he was beheaded for his faith. But Paul says this in 2 Timothy 4:10. He says, for Demas, he's telling all these people that he knew and that were, had been followers of Jesus and helped him in his ministry. He said this in chapter 4, verse 10. He says, for Demas has deserted me for love of this present world. Like, one of the guys just walked away from him. That had to have been heartbreaking. He's gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia, but here it says, Luke alone is with me. So that tells us a lot about Luke's character, that he was a very, very faithful friend. Most people think Luke was written about 62 AD, which is about 30 years after Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. And the reason why we have Luke is because there was a very wealthy man by the name of Theophilus. We know nothing about him except that what it says here in the first few verses of Luke. And Theophilus was either a Christian and he was, questioning all the things that he was hearing, or he was not a Christian and he wanted to know if what he was hearing about Jesus was actually true. Look at Luke 1:1. It tells us a lot about what was going on back then. It says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. In other words, he's saying back then, there's a lot of people that are trying to write down what happened with Jesus. But I'm going to assume that there was a lot of fake news back then, just like there is today. So maybe Theophilus was like, I just want to know the truth. I want to know truth from error and myth and all those. He just didn't know. And so he hires Luke to go and find out everything he needs to know. Because think about this. All of a sudden, Jesus shows up. Now, remember, if you're not Jewish and you didn't have, the Old Testament scriptures, this is going to feel weird. This guy shows up, he heals the sick, he raises the dead, he dies on a cross, he himself rises from the dead. And so there's people that are confused. And Theophilus, maybe he was a Gentile and he was really confused. And so Luke wants to write this to let everyone know why Jesus did this. He wants people to know who Jesus was. And so what happens in verse 3 is he says this, therefore, since I myself, Luke is saying this, carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. It seems like Theophilus most likely was a Christian, because if he were, he had been taught this, or he had been taught this and he still wasn't quite sure if he believed it or not. So like I said, we don't really know what's what, but Luke's job was to write an orderly account for Theophilus so he could understand what was being told to him. So Theophilus wants somebody to go and investigate Christianity, investigate everything. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Was Jesus really honestly who he said he was? So he hires Luke to go write an account. But remember, when Luke was writing this, he was writing it for Theophilus. It never probably occurred to him that he would make it into the New Testament as one of the 4 Gospels, because there wasn't a New Testament back then. So it wasn't like he was like, oh man, I'm going to write this account and hopefully it makes it into the good book. Well, it wasn't like that, because the New Testament hadn't been written yet. I mean, there was just manuscripts and, scrolls, and people were writing things and, distributing them around the churches, but they didn't have a New Testament like we do today. And it probably never dawned on Luke that what he was writing would actually be read by people 2,000 years later, like we're reading. So when Luke comes on the scene, like I said, he's not writing as an eyewitness, because to our knowledge, he wasn't there. Luke is writing as a reporter, a historian, a journalist. And it's his job to go find all the people that were in contact with Jesus. He would go to find those who followed Jesus, those who saw him die on a cross, those who saw him after he rose from the dead. And he would go talk to them, write everything down, and that is how we would get the book of Luke. I was thinking about it, like, let's say I had a whole bunch of money, and I really loved Billy Graham, so I want to know everything about Billy Graham's life. So I'm going to hire an investigative reporter to fly all over the world and meet all the people who ever had contact with Billy. And the person that I hired would go interview his kids, his friends, the people who got saved out of his ministry. And then they would compile all of this, and we would have a Billy Graham biography. So that's kind of what's going on with Luke. Luke was hired by Theophilus to report everything and document everything. And because of that, Luke is one of the most exhaustive accounts of the life of Jesus that we have. Chuck Swindoll says this in his commentary on Luke. He said, Luke's account isn't so much, hey, let me tell you about Jesus so you can believe in him. Instead, he says this. He said, Luke's account is more like this. Let me tell you why your Christian faith is so reasonable. Like I want you to see Jesus for who he is. I want you to see that he's God, and that he's awesome, and that he loves people, and he's compassionate, and he's wonderful. And that's what Luke wants us to see. Now, what's different about Luke is that what he writes, there are accounts of Jesus that are not written in any other gospel. Luke has 18 unique parables in the Gospel of Luke, only found in Luke. Like the Good Samaritan, the lost sheep, the prodigal son, they're only found in the book of Luke. Luke also talks a lot about women. He talks about their stories like 45 times in the Gospel of Luke. The birth narrative of Jesus and John the Baptist are told from the women's perspective, Mary and Elizabeth. Luke doesn't forget to mention the women who followed Jesus, to where he was buried. Jesus also, is not remiss in saying, hey, the first appearance was by the women. So Jesus had a heart and compassion for women, especially in that time. Now, what's interesting is Luke doesn't write a lot about Jesus's power over nature. That doesn't seem to be too important to him. But I think it's interesting, Matthew does. Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, he writes a lot about, Jesus, did all these amazing, miraculous things, calmed the Sea of Galilee, and just things that were more nature-driven. But Luke doesn't do that. And I think it's because Matthew really wants people to say that show that Jesus is God. Like, this is really him. He can do all these amazing, miraculous things, feeding 5,000, feeding 4,000. I mean, that's what he wanted people to believe in. But for Luke was more of a people person, and he just wants us to know Jesus really well. He wants us to know what kind of a person Jesus is. And Luke did his homework. And so he wanted to give us a detailed account of who Jesus was, and why it matters to us 2,000 years later is because it really does matter. Especially when we know that John says Jesus is the only way to God. You can't get there by a religion. You can't get there by being a good person. None of those. And Jesus proved that by loving people, healing people, and then rising from the dead 3 days after he died. That is the message that Luke wants to give us. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what Luke is about, and we will continue on next week.